Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 63 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Several hours passed from the time the messenger arrived to when the retinue's survivors stumbled into the castle. Lord Caerson requested Janir's presence almost at once. With Carlisle and Seovan on either side, Janir rounded a corner into a gallery. The walls were bedecked with tapestries attesting to the needlepoint prowess of the Kesson women. There were colorful depictions of hunt scenes and banquets, happy, carefree places that Janir would have loved to visit in that moment. "Janir?" Carlisle frowned, looking her over. She took deep breaths. It wasn't this bad. There was absolutely no reason for her to be panicking like this. "Is something wrong?" Seovan touched her arm. The elf and enchanter had offered to accompany her to the reintroduction with her foster father. She still had only the vaguest memories of the man. "I'm fine," she replied, still refusing to move. "He doesn't bite, Janir," Carlisle assured her. "I promise." Janir attempted a smile, but the result was more akin to a grimace. "Janir, you said you trust us," Carlisle said. "It'll be all right." "I trust you, but—" "No buts." "I know, but—" Carlisle cut her off with a groan of frustration. "Carissima." Seovan lightly caressed the side of her face with his fingertips. Janir closed her eyes, enjoying the tender way he touched her. She thought she would never tire of the way he touched her. "Armandius loves you as a daughter." "You told me." She plucked at the hem of her sleeve. "He only wants what's best for you," Seovan added. Janir sighed. Seovan's fingers slid down and lifted her chin to meet his gaze. "As do I." In his eyes, she could see all her feelings for him reflected back. It was the most breathtaking view she could imagine. "I can't fathom what you are going through." Seovan brushed back the loose strands of hair from her face. "Not having any memory of half your life. But I want to help you as best I can." Janir smiled wanly. "If it weren't for you, this castle would be occupied by the armies of the Slavish Sultan." Seovan smiled back. "I rather think it was a group effort." He pecked her forehead. "Trust me, Armandius is not someone you ever have to fear. He wants to help you, too." Carlisle coughed. "Yes, well, I'm still here, in case you two forgot. Try not to let this get awkward." Janir turned to the enchanter. Before she could reply, the door down the hall burst open. Out came a man in stained traveling clothes, with a green-tinted sword hanging from his hip. Janir realized at once that the sword was interwoven with old, weathered magic. It must be the third, and its wearer must be Lord Caerson. She stared at the man, fighting to recall him, but her mind was blank as fresh parchment. "Lord Caerson." Carlisle bowed. Armandius Caerson was nearing the end of his prime, with a dark red head of hair beginning to show streaks of silver. His beard was uneven from weeks of traveling. His build was solid and muscular, but not as lean as Seovan. There were dark circles bruised around his eyes. He was tall, towering above Janir's head. Janir swallowed as this man, this stranger, strode toward her. He came straight for her without speaking, then drew up short, his face twisting as though in pain. Janir realized she had taken a step back, partly hiding herself behind Seovan. "Janir?" Armandius spoke her name cautiously, like a hunter not wanting to frighten off his quarry. "Janir, it's me." He watched her hopefully, as though he had fully trusted that, upon seeing him, she would remember. But she didn't. "Lord Kierson," she said, her voice coming out as more of a croak. "My father told you she does not remember. She cannot," Seovan added, keeping his voice calm, reasoning. Armandius took a step forward. "Janir." Inadvertently, Janir moved closer to Seovan. The gesture didn't escape Armandius. Janir noticed him scrutinize their entwined hands with a frown of disapproval. Was Armandius going to separate her from Seovan? He could, if he was her guardian. "Janir." Seovan's voice was calm and persuasive, like someone coaxing a puppy from under a bed. Janir stared at the man behind Seovan, wishing he could have let her have more time to prepare. Then again, they'd known he was coming for weeks. She swallowed. "Go on," Seovan urged, nudging her toward the High Lord. "It's all right." He released her hand. Armandius forced a weak smile. "My child." He took another step toward her. This time, Janir didn't retreat. She trusted Seovan, and if he said this man would die for her, she would believe it. Armandius drew up short again. He sighed and glanced sideways. For a moment, he looked so very old. Finding her voice, Janir managed to speak. Do you need to rest? I know you have been through much today." Armandius smiled wanly. "No, I'll be fine. Would you? Can I show you something?" Janir glanced to Seovan and Kariel. The enchanter made playful shooing motions and Seovan nodded. "It's all right." Janir took a deep breath. She looked back to Armandius. "All right." Armandius bobbed his head once. "Very well, then. It's this way." He turned and made to return back down the hallway. Janir stayed put. "Go on," Seovan urged. "That man nearly started a civil war over you. It will be fine." Janir hesitated, sharing a final glance with the elf. "He knows now." She kept her voice down, almost in a whisper. The corners of Seovan's mouth turned up slightly. "It will be me he comes after, not you." That statement did little to reassure her, but she finally capitulated and trotted after Armandius, who waited by an archway. She followed him, but secretly took comfort in the cool weight of the black rods stowed in her boots. Outside, it had stopped raining, but the courtyard was dotted with muddy puddles beneath the gauzed sky. Janir followed Armandius, having some difficulty keeping up with his long, swift strides. He had brought her to the stables. Very little conversation passed between the two of them. Neither seemed certain of what to say to the other. The few words they did exchange had been enough to frustrate Janir at her lack of memory. Armandius must have realized he was making things worse. He led the way into Lord Kessam's stables. The stone floor was scattered with wet straw, and the air was thick with the musty, sweet smell of horses. Janir was glad that she had worn boots. The light slippers usually worn by ladies would have all but fallen apart on the rough ground. She almost ran into Armandius when he suddenly stopped in front of a large stall. Inside was a stallion, with the build of meticulous breeding under his thick winter coat. There were stains on his legs, and mud splattered on his belly from weeks of traveling. He was a deep bay, with a thick black mane and tail. His ears flicked attentively as he chomped at the straw in his manger. Janir stared at the horse. When spring came and his coat was sleek and short, he would be a sight to behold. Even in his shaggy winter fashion, he was gorgeous. Janir realized that while she stared at the stallion, Armandius stared at her. She ducked her head, one hand fisting in the folds of her skirt. "This is Colbo," Armandius explained. "He's been yours since he was a yearling." Before Janir had the chance to reply, Colbo, the horse, turned his head at Armandius's voice. Colbo snorted and was at the front of his stall in an instant. He nickered, nostrils flaring, enthusiastically nuzzling Janir's neck. Janir jumped back, startled. "Not so fast." Colbo nickered again and watched her with pricked ears. Armandius observed their exchange with a strange expression on his face, one halfway between amusement and sadness. He patted the stallion's muscular neck. Janir stood back, watching her foster father and the powerful creature that seemed to know her. She had a misty idea that hovered in the back of her mind that there had been a bay stallion. It wasn't a memory, it wasn't strong enough for that. But the thought was there. Why would it be there for an animal, but not someone as important as Armandius? Had the Lord Argotolum simply taken his place in her mind? After Armandius paused. "When you were gone, he paced his stall for days." Armandius stroked Colbo's coat absently. "And then I received word from Velasquez that you were safe, and it was time to bring Lady Reladaman here." Armandius stopped petting the horse. He sighed and closed his eyes. Again, Janir thought how tired he looked. He sighed and closed his eyes. Again, Janir thought how tired he looked. "Father," Janir frowned. "Yes." Janir blinked. Her mind went foggy in an instant. "I'm sorry, Janir?" "Yes?" Armandius opened his mouth to speak, but swallowed the words. "Never mind." He looked back inside the stallion's stall as if he'd dropped something. Colbo was still standing with his chest flush against the front, eyeing her intently. Carefully, Janir extended her hand out to the stallion. He nosed it affectionately. His long whiskers tickled her palm, and she giggled. Colbo lowered his muzzle, his height allowing him to reach farther over the top of his stall than most horses. He nosed her fingers, lips nibbling at her hands. Janir could still see Armandius watching her. She didn't look at him, but he scarcely moved. Janir cleared her throat, feeling she should say something, anything to not do with the attack today. Did you give me Colbo?" she asked, the name tasting odd on her tongue. Armandius straightened a little. "After a manner of speaking." "Tell me." Seovan and Kyle had been taking turns lately, telling her stories that they knew. While it did little to bring back what was lost, learning her memories could hardly be harmful, could it? At least it couldn't hurt to hear one more. Armandius sighed. "You were about 11 or 10, I think." He appeared contemplative. "It doesn't really matter." Armandius waved his hand as though brushing off the thought. "My head groom, a livery, had been teaching you to ride, and you were doing so well that we decided it was time for you to have your own horse." Janir listened, running her fingers through Colbo's wiry mane as the animal lipped her other hand. "So, at the end of the year, I took you to the yearling pens and told you to pick one." Armandius shifted, one boot scuffing on the stone. "You were so excited. You ran around the outside of the pens, peering at all the colts and fillies. I could tell you were struggling to choose." Armandius laughed, a brief, staccato noise that faded away as soon as it sounded. but was still laced with tenderness and nostalgia. Janir kept her eyes on him, prompting him to go on.
And then you saw this.
Armandius frowned, trying to find the right words.
This filthy bag of bones standing in one corner. You looked between that thing and all the others, and you told me he was the one you wanted.
Janir glanced to Kalbo. This towering specimen hardly held resemblance to an emaciated colt.
I tried to talk you out of it, of course, but you were persistent. You kept reminding me of how I'd said you could pick one, and that was the one you'd chosen. When I asked you why, you said it was because he needed you to take care of him the most.
Armandius rubbed the back of his neck.
I was sure he would be dead within a week, but I let you put him in our stables anyway. Dame Celila almost had to drag you to bed. You wanted to spend the night in his stall.
Kalbo nickered suddenly, as though agreeing.
First thing the next morning, you were off to the stables again. You practically lived in his stall, making sure that he ate and was comfortable. You talked of nothing but him at dinner. I remember dreading how crushed you would be when he died.
Janir listened to Armandius's story, more focused on the way he said the words, the way he told the story with a nostalgic, almost longing.
But as the days wore into weeks, I started to wonder. 3 months later, I went out to the stables looking for you, and found you brushing one of the finest colts I'd ever seen.
Armandius patted Kalbo's neck, and the horse snickered again.
He would follow you anywhere, with or without a bridle.
Janir stroked Kalbo's cheek. If they had bonded like that, it would explain why the horse had remembered her, even if she couldn't remember him. Even if... Janir hesitated. She turned to Armandius. Even if I never remember everything, I do know.
Armandius's brow creased slightly. Know what?
Janir dropped off, hesitating. You must have loved my mother very much.
Yes.
Armandius blinked. You must love me very much.
I do.
Then that's good enough for me. Next thing she knew, Armandius had wrapped her in a smothering embrace. It was awkward, a little uncomfortable, but after a moment, Janir hugged him back. He was more father to her than the Lord Architolum ever had been. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.